Alright, everyone, today's video we're gonna react to is the bizarre case of Super Smash Bros. Melee. It's a pretty long video, but have gotten a lot of views, and I got recommended to watch this video. So let's check it out. Let's see what it's all about.
In the entire history of Nintendo games, and fighting games in general, there is no story surrounding a game as bizarre, enthralling, and utterly insane as there is for Super Smash Bros. Melee. And I'm not just saying that because Pichu's in it. From the moment of this game's conception all the way until the modern day, the story surrounding Melee has remained ever-turning, ever-changing. Like there's some kind of supernatural force emanating from it that refuses to let the game fade. After the original Super Smash Bros. Was released and was a decent success, Nintendo greenlit a sequel almost immediately, giving Sakurai and his team as many resources as they could possibly need. Except there was one teensy tiny little catch, which was the not at all terrifying revelation that the team would only have 13 months to make the game, as it was going to be the big attention getter of the GameCube's launch. Now this is a tiny amount of time for any game, but for one that not only needed to have way more content than its predecessor with the same amount of development time, that needed to be made for more complex hardware, and most importantly needed to not just be good, but needed to impress. This was a terrifying prospect for the team. The game would go through an incredibly turbulent development schedule.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's always like crossed my mind. Like, imagine if they gave the development team like another year for the game, right? Like, you know, with the direction, you know, Brawl, Smash 4, Ultimate, and so on took, always made me wonder, like, what advanced stuff in Melee would have made the cut if they actually had, like, more time? Like, I'm not gonna say, like, oh, like, you know, it was all intentional or it was all an accident. I mean, I think it's a combination of both. And I mean, I do think the fact that Melee was so technically advanced made them, like, take a different direction. But still, with some more time, I don't know. It's hard to say.
With the team feeling the pressure weighing down on them the entire time. Sakurai himself took almost no days off, sometimes working for 40 hours straight, only to go home, sleep for 4, and then head back to start it all again. And the entire team likely went through similar things. After a development like this, it wouldn't have been a surprise if the game turned out as an unmitigated disaster. A barely complete package held together by duct tape and glue to try and accomplish the outline of what was promised. But for all of that strife and suffering, it must have been an absolute relief when the game finally released and was a success the likes of which the team would have never expected. The game got rave reviews and quickly became the crown jewel of the GameCube's lineup. Kids, teenagers, and adults alike became infatuated with this game, creating dozens of memories built around a game that was somehow equal parts polished and uncanny, featuring concepts and ideas the likes of which most multiplayer games at the time would have never tried. But that success would not be the end of the story, as just when the game should have faded off into the sunset, an extremely dedicated group of people would stick by it, reviving it and eventually making it into a competitive marvel beyond what any would have ever expected. And yet, despite what would seem to be an unmitigated success story, that couldn't be further from the case, as the game has only had to face strife and suffering very few communities ever do, and all of it coming from the very company that brought it into existence in the first place.
Alright, so one thing I will say here, like, for a lot of people that may not have been around during, like, Melee's early days, and I'm not even talking about competitive Melee, but, like, just, you know, casually as well. Like, these days, a lot of people talk about, like, how, you know, not casual friendly Melee is, but as someone that grew up playing this game casually for years before Melee tournaments, at least to my knowledge, was a thing. I mean, they did start very early in certain parts of the world, but I mean, I remember playing it as a kid casually for years with friends, and everyone was having, like, an amazing time, right? Of course, with, you know, sequels to Melee, more characters, more stages, so more casual friendly in that sense. But I mean, I never really heard people talk about, like, it was, you know, too hard for casuals to play Melee. I mean, I feel like that was more of a concept that was, like, more talked and pushed afterwards, right? When you had, like, a direct comparison. But I also feel like, I could be wrong here, but sometimes I get the impression that it's, like, people that, like, semi know about the competitive scene, or even maybe know about it quite a lot, but are not that good. But I mean, at least casually, when I was playing with, like, a lot of different friend groups as well, no one talked about, like, oh, this game is, like, too hard. People used to, like, playing casually, having fun. I don't know. I'm only one person, so of course my experience, I'm not trying to say that's like that was the case for everyone, but at least that was my experience growing up playing it casually, having no idea what like wave dash or L cancel or any of that was.
But for all of that strife, for all of that success, for all of that love, you'd have to imagine that the game at the core of all of it would have to be something pretty special. And in that case, you couldn't be more correct.
This intro is so amazing.
So join me in the next part of my Super Smash Bros. Retrospective series as I cover Super Smash Bros. Melee, the weirdest, most bizarre, most captivating game in the series.
Super Smash Brothers Melee!
That part right there, that always just reminds me of like the Evo intro.
The game starts with a gorgeous orchestrated intro cinematic featuring all of Nintendo's All-Stars and Ice Climbers, all presented with a grace and quality that hadn't quite been seen before.
Poor Ice
And while that
Climbers.
was impressive enough, that polish extended to the game itself as well. Everything in Melee, from the feel of the attacks to the pace of the characters, everything
go,
has just been
Peach.
dramatically
Let's go.
improved. This game just flows now. Like any of the previous clunk of its predecessor has been shaken off, really allowing the core gameplay to shine brighter than ever. Old moves have been polished and improved, with the characters also not only getting new chargeable smash attacks, but also a completely new move in the form of pressing side and B. And speaking of the characters, all of them just play better. Like across the board, they just feel so much better to actually play as. And like, this isn't even talking about the game on a competitive level because
Ready? Go! Wow! Incredible!
yet I'm not anywhere near that good at the game. I'm less of a no items, Fox only, Final Destination guy, and more of a
That is Melee.
floats
That is
whatever
Melee.
character you want, all red shells kind of guy, if you catch my drift. And yet, even to me, the jump from 64 to Melee is incredibly obvious. Everything from punches to kicks to blocks to grabs to smashes and crashes, everything in Melee just feels good. The only real downgrade is probably the sound design, which isn't nearly as crunchy as 64, so that's a little sad. But outside of that, the game is an absolute blast to play. And
I've
an
never heard
improvement over
someone
its
saying
predecessor
that,
in
but I mean, it
every
makes
way.
sense.
Every
Different
game
people,
after
different
this would
opinions.
pretty much try to replicate Melee's general feel to varying degrees of success, and I think that shows just how much they got right out the gate. Though, funnily enough, before you even get to notice that much, you'll likely first notice just how much more there is in this game. More modes, more stages, and most importantly, way more characters. The game starts out with 14 characters unlocked, 2 more than the total roster of the original. And while 64's focus was on bringing Nintendo's biggest all-stars in, Melee's roster is different, weird, like really weird. Bowser was the main villain of the Mario series and was pretty much a shoo-in to make it into the roster at some point. Though I think it's funny that in the normal Mario games, Bowser's this big goofy guy, a loving father who's equal parts over the top and kinda sensitive, and in Smash the dude looks like he's gonna bite your head off. And along the same line, the Mario
The
one.
best addition to the game.
We also get the other major
I'll say, like, unlocking characters as a kid, like, now you know all the characters prior, right? But I mean, as a kid playing this game, I had no idea some characters that, like, made it in. I feel like it made it more hype to unlock characters. Like, I understand, like, they want to advertise and, like, show as much as possible, but it would be cool if, like, some characters you had no idea they were going to be in, and you unlock them on release, right? That would be so hype. That would be so hype. But, yeah, it's just not how things works, I guess. Another thing, though, also, like, since talking about, like, more characters, more stages and stuff, I kind of wonder what approach they're going to have with, like, the next Smash after Ultimate, because I feel like having even more characters, that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard to beat. But that is, of course, like, a big casual appeal. More characters, more stages. I mean, they could top it in terms of, like, more characters, but I don't see it as a given.
Mario character who didn't make it into 64, Princess Peach. While her playable roles were limited to spin-offs and Mario 2, the actually good Mario 2, Peach still made total sense considering she's pretty much the most important character after these three. Now, I'm not sure why her ass is so explosive in this game, but you know what? I approve. And honestly, while there's kind of a lot of Mario characters considering the roster size, with Mario, Luigi, Peach, Bowser, and this green thing, it feels like the series is perfectly represented here, and Dr. Mario? I mean, I guess that's fine, but Luigi is already kind of a Mario clone, and this is literally just Mario who took 40 Benadryls, so why is he here? Whatever, sure, fine, I guess. Speaking of getting...
Yeah, this might be mentioned, but I mean, I think the reasonable conclusion is that, similar character to Mario, so you can get one more slot without too much extra effort. You have quite a few of those type of characters in Melee, like Dr. Mario, Link, Young Link. It's, yeah. I mean, maybe not as, unique. And to be fair, in some cases, like Fox Falco, they obviously play incredibly different. But from a design perspective, it must be, just way easier. Way easier. Similar moveset and, just adjust some stuff. So, Sakurai said himself, not enough time to add Wario. Dude, imagine Wario in Melee. I'm not sure if I want to imagine that.
Getting 3 reps, Zelda was such a massive series at this point that it's not too shocking that we got at least a couple more. And with that in mind, I have a question for you guys. What if Zelda was a girl? Princess Zelda had long been established as a major part of the series that, has her own name on it, and being that she's one of the 3 Triforce holders, it really only makes sense to have her here. And speaking of the Triforce holders, if we were getting another Zelda character, it only makes sense that it'd be the Manon, the myth, the legend, Ganondorf, who feels a lot like Captain Falcon here, actually. Okay, guys, I got a question for you. What if Zelda was a boy? Well, anyways, these 3 choices feel like good representation for Zelda, and so I think it's fair that... Excuse me? Young Link?
Yep, same concept.
Link again.
Same concept.
A kid? A child? A boy? Why? What the fuck is this? Yes, the most notorious part of the roster by far is that Melee is infested with clones. Characters that look and play incredibly similar to other characters from the roster. And you know what? They're cool. I mean, realistically, these have always been bonuses.
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, from a casual point of view, it's extra, justified to feel that way. I mean, it makes sense. Someone that don't know about competitive Smash is Fox Falco, basically the same character. But, yeah, of course. The more you know, the better you get, the more different the characters are. Even, Link and Young Link, for example, or Mario, Dr. Mario. But, yeah, I mean, from a casual point of view, it makes sense to not feel too good about it. But again, with a short development period time, I mean, I feel like they only have the opportunity to otherwise remove the characters and get no extra characters in place of those. So, I mean, better than nothing, especially with Fox Falco.
End of the day, and as a kid, I was just happy to have more characters. And while Dr. Mario and Young Link feel a little lame considering they're just the same guy, I honestly feel like the rest are pretty fun. Ganondorf brings that Captain Falcon energy with a touch more raw malice. Falco brings all the fun of Fox with an added dash of cool boy swagger. Pichu. And how could I forget...
Damn, all the Pichu hate.
Who are you?
And this is where the Smash series got introduced to the bane of every Smash fan's existence, and the thing that keeps all good boys and girls awake at night. Yes, Fire Emblem, the at the time exclusively Japanese strategy RPG series featuring anime swordsmen who thankfully decided to wear pants in their Smash appearance. Marth was from the original Fire Emblem, subtitled Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, which while starting out as a cult hit, slowly rose into a juggernaut of a franchise in Japan.
Imagine if Marth and Roy was not included for the Western release.
After Melee somehow, and only in Japan. You see, Nintendo of America didn't really think we here in the West would vibe with any of this stuff going on right here. So much so that Marth and Roy were almost removed completely from Melee in the Western release. But I
Yep.
guess in the end they figured they'd just leave him in anyways, Japanese voices and all. And I am so glad they did. He's my main and I love him. Fire Emblem wasn't the only new universe introduced with Melee though. Take the Ice Climbers, a tag team duo from the NES game of the same name. And I just want to ask, why these characters and why this game? You ever played Ice Climbers? Game's terrible, like bottom of the barrel garbage.
Dude, I'll say, not that like the Ice Climber game is, that relevant, but I'll say the momentum in that game when you're jumping, it's actually insane how little you can drift. It makes it a lot harder than it might look at first glance. Yeah, it's terrible aerial drift.
I honestly don't mind their inclusion because they're kind of cute looking and their moveset's really interesting. They're just a very, very odd choice. But not nearly as odd as whatever the heck this thing was. Mr. Game & Watch was a representative of the earliest parts of Nintendo's gaming career, amalgamating a ton of different handheld games into one utterly bizarre character. There was always something so alien about him. Everything from his odd movement style to his strange appearance to the borderline ominous music associated with him just made him feel so out of place and eerie. And to round out the cast, we have the new Pokemon rep for the game. Hey, wait a minute, that's not the one we shoot. He's cool, okay? He's cool. Mewtwo was a fairly major Pokemon in the series, not only being a secret boss and the most OP Pokemon in Gen 1, but also being the main focus of his very own movie, so he feels like a fairly logical pick here. He's just got this cool presence that doesn't actually feel like it matches his kind of awkward moveset. And that is the roster of newcomers for Melee. Definitely a stranger set than its predecessor, but as weird as this sounds, I kinda prefer it that way. Additions like Mario, Link, Pikachu, these are huge additions, but they feel pretty obvious. I kinda prefer it when Smash is picking more wild additions, and this game is just chock full of stuff like that. I didn't know who half of
Yeah, for Mewtwo added, that was like the coolest thing as a kid. But I will say, learning more about Melee and learning that Mewtwo wasn't like a great character, that was so disappointing. The strongest Pokemon, stronger than Mew, or whatever Mewtwo says in the movie. It was so disappointing to realize that this character is bad, even though he actually didn't end up being quite as bad as a lot of people believed at the time. But still sad. But then with PM, when he was like broken as fuck, it was like, all right, maybe they did the right choice after all.
these goobers were when I was a kid, but I loved them anyways, and considering my main was from a franchise I'd never even heard of at the time, I think that says a lot about just how much fun these characters were to actually play as. But while the roster was insanely impressive considering what we'd gotten before, the character additions aren't the only thing Melee expanded on. The stage roster has been upgraded from a paltry 9 to 29 whole stages, and while a couple returned from 64, way more of them are completely
Dude, it was always
original to
weird
the
in Smash
scene,
64
and
how
they
some
are
of the
a
playable
bunch of
stages in
bangers.
like
I don't
story
think it's a
modes and
stretch to
stuff
say
and like
this
single
might
player
just be my
modes wasn't
favorite
like
roster of new stages
in
any
multiplayer.
Smash game. Ness and Captain Falcon kinda got gypped in 64, not having a single stage to their name. So I guess to make up for that, each one got 2 different stages. You got Onett, a quaint cozy little stage that feels like it fits the vibe of early Earthbound really well. And then you have Foreside, which feels like it fits the other side of Earthbound. Captain Falcon also got 2 high-octane stages befitting of the fast-paced action of his games. One that's chaotic and one that's just complete nonsense. But if you want a little less nonsense, Melee has you covered. Not only with what would become a series tradition with Final Destination and Battlefield, but
Metal
if you want a
Mario
bit of a
stage
different
was
vibe,
nice.
why not go with Fountain of Dreams? This absolutely beautiful stage that still looks pretty impressive for an early GameCube game. Peach's Castle has seen it glow up like never before. Metroid got 2 stages, and while one was this goofy lava-filled
Favorite casual stage. Favorite casual stage. Best casual stage. I'll claim it. I'll claim it. People need to know. Best casual stage in the game. And also on it, when that was on, legally in tournament, fighting foxes there, you don't know pain. You don't know pain before you have experienced that.
adventure with a bunch of imagery that I had a lot of questions about when I was a kid. Brinstar Depths was the exact opposite, and even had the honor of scaring the absolute shit out of me. So it was great, clearly. Great Bay was an absolutely beautiful Zelda stage. And speaking of Zelda, if you wanted to really mess around, you took your friends to Temple, which was so huge that matches could stretch on for so much longer than ever before. Seriously, Green Greens, Pokemon Stadium, Yoshi's Island, Poke Floats. I could seriously keep going on like this because most of these stages are just that good. Though, of course, that doesn't account for the Nightmare Realms. I'm looking at you, Icicle Mountain. With all this stage scrolling, it's hard not to get sick of all this nonsense. You get what I'm saying?
I'll say for Temple, like, I don't know how common this was, but I know for us, when we, like, just had started getting into competitive Smash, me, Android, and Neolas, we always had this tradition, like, before we were gonna start having a session, since it was three of us, right? We always started playing on Temple. I think it was like one game. We were partially using it as practice to like learn wall techs. And then it was like whoever plays top 2 got to play like the first singles match. Something along these lines. It's been so many years. But yeah, it was a combination of like practicing techs and get to decide who gets to start to play singles.
I'm not apologizing for that joke. I'm leaving that in. And Mushroom Kingdom 2? Well, not invited to my birthday party. Let's just put it that way. Still, this stage roster was just fantastic. And it's genuinely shocking to see just how much of a leap Melee makes over 64 in terms of not only the amount, but the quality of the stages as well. And that trend continues with what is probably the least discussed and most underrated part of these games, the soundtrack. It always feels like in all the discussion of the new characters and new universes, no one really takes time to discuss just how phenomenal Smash's remixes and original soundtrack are. And while 64 had a solid enough soundtrack, Melee was on a whole other level. Whether it be the wacky over-the-top flair of Big Blue, the goofy energy of Poke Floats,
Second best casual stage.
or the bizarrely intimidating sound of Brinstar Depths. Melee's soundtrack has a variety and a resonance that's honestly incredible. Oftentimes, they were taking songs that were already phenomenal in their own right and somehow managing to make something even better out of them, which is kind of mind-blowing. But of all the things to get the greatest track, of all the things to get the funkiest theme, how is it possible that they gave the best track in the game to the Target minigame?
I've heard this one more than enough. I mean, Target Test is actually very fun.
Roster, to the stages, to the
It's a shame
design,
in
to the
Brawl
music,
that they made like
everything in
5
Melee has been
stages for all
upgraded to such an
characters
extent
rather
that it's
than unique
sometimes
stages.
hard to believe that they managed to cram all this in such a short stretch of time. Again, this game had 13 months of development, and yet as a multiplayer experience alone, this game has more content than most fighting games of the time could ever hope to have. My friends and I would spend hours with Melee's multiplayer, to a degree that even if it had just been a multiplayer game and that's it, it still would have felt just as full and exciting as any other game we'd played. But here's the thing. While I would have loved the game as just a multiplayer game alone, that didn't have to be the case, as Melee would end up being much more than just that, expanding what could have been a minor footnote of the experience into one of the coolest things about it. To me, there's something really special about a game breaking past the conventions of its genre and making something truly special out of it. Whether it be a platformer having a shockingly engaging storyline, a single-player game coming out with a surprisingly interesting multiplayer mode, or the simple addition of some incredibly fun minigames in a package that was already filled to the bursting with content. There's just something so impressive about a game doing more than it has to. And while Melee could have easily gotten away with just being a fantastic multiplayer game, that wasn't what they did here, as Melee was committed to being just as exciting in single player as it was in multiplayer. Classic mode was brought back from 64, but was polished and expanded. You still fight through an array of different battles with different opponents under different contexts, but there's much more variation to the mode as a whole now. You're not just fighting Giant DK, a team of Yoshis, and Metal Mario for every single character. No, now it could be Giant Captain Falcon, a team of Nesses, Metal Ice Climbers. The mode has been randomized, which just adds so much replayability to the mode as a whole. And on top of that, they brought back the minigames from 64. Besides board the platforms. And these mini games have been so bolstered by
They should have had board the
hardware that
platforms
they
in this
now have
game too.
newfound
That was also a
energy
lot
that
of
I
fun.
just can't get enough of. And the game as a whole even has a couple of its own exclusive mini games. Home Run Contest allowed the player to try and rack up as much damage as they could on this sandbag, hoping to launch it as far as possible. I'm gonna do a pro move right here. Nailed it. And Multi-Man Smash had you facing waves and waves of these kind of uncanny versions of base game characters under a bunch of different contexts too. And that's not all Melee added. All-Star Mode was this cool little mode where you could run through fights with every single character in the roster, all with a limited pool of healing items as well. There's always something so exciting about the risk of each battle. Like, obviously, you don't want to run.
Yeah, board the platform was a lot more fun than multi-melee, or multi-man melee. Absolutely. I think most people would agree with that.
Potentially risking the whole run up to that point. It's incredibly fun in every incarnation, and that includes Melee as well. But maybe you want your single player with a bit more context. Well, Melee has you covered with that too, with Event Mode, a set of 51 different battles, each having their own creative context or gimmick. Perhaps you have to keep an egg out of the hands of CPUs, or play a match as Giant Bowser versus a Giant DK. Brilliant. Maybe play a match in that game mode that I always forget exists for some reason, or have a match where you can only kill with Pokemon that get released from a Pokeball. Ever wanted to battle on an Entei?
Yeah, that is not a hot take though. I think 95% of the people will agree Pokeballs are the best item in Melee. Like the most fun casually. Just playing with Pokeballs only. If I'm gonna play a casual match of Melee with items, Pokeballs only.
It's weirdly specific, but you can do it here, rest assured. Stuff like this is uncanny and weird in a way that only GameCube games could be, and I kind of love it. From time paradoxes to fighting Fox and Falco made permanently invisible by Slippy, to everyone just having it out for Jigglypuff for some reason, each fight has some kind of cool context behind it. Honestly, the only problem I have with this mode is that there isn't more of them. 51 sounds like a lot, but half of these are so easy that it basically ends up being like 20 instead. Still, with this classic mode, all-star mode, and the mini games, his game is already an incredible leap over its predecessor in terms of content. But so far, you might be hearing all this and wondering, okay, but what's the point of doing all this just to do it? And that's the thing. While all of this content was definitely cool on its own, Melee did something brilliant here. Because not only was this stuff cool in its own right, but it linked up with the multiplayer in a way that was an absolute stroke of genius. The Challenger approaching scene would become iconic as time went on, but if you've noticed anything, it's that it's always melees that people seem to remember, and there's a very good reason why. Because while some games make the unlock process a little too easy and basic, Melee was different. Sure, you could unlock all the characters through multiplayer matches, but unless you wanted to run off a stage like 900 times to unlock Roy, then your best option was to find them in the single player modes. And they started off basic, only requiring you to play classic mode once to unlock Jigglypuff. But from there, the player would have to spend time in all the different modes, even the seemingly ancillary minigame ones if they wanted to unlock the rest of the roster. This kept the unlocking process exciting, as you never knew when something you did would miraculously end with that oh so enthralling Challenger approaching screen. But far more importantly, this meant that you were actively engaging with the game in other ways than just versus matches, ways that were designed to get the player better at the core fighting or to understand how a character's mechanics worked on a much stronger level. Basically, you played the single player modes to unlock more characters for the multiplayer mode, thereby making you better at the core game and the multiplayer as a whole. It's just such a smart decision, forcing the player to better engage with the entire game to improve their skill going forward. Though what was even cooler is that even after—
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like pros and cons here. Like, thinking back of like unlocking characters in Melee, like it was fun, right? It was fun and exciting not knowing which character was next. Some characters you didn't even know were in the game at the time. But I mean, thinking about it in Ultimate, I mean, of course, it's a lot more characters, right? But I'm very thankful that language glitch existed, so you could just unlock characters and just play multiplayer with whatever character you wanted to play, right? But I mean, I can understand, like, I can see both sides. I mean, the best would be if there is a quick way and a more like experiment your way through and getting to unlock everything, right? But like in Ultimate, I personally would have disliked it if I had to like go through everything for like a billion hours to even get to play all the characters. But with a smaller roster, yeah, I mean, I guess it's fine.
After you unlocked all of the characters, there was still a major reason to keep playing the single player stuff. This is where the series would be introduced to its signature collectible, the trophies. They were these cute little figurines you'd get for a variety of actions, whether that be as a reward for a full classic mode run, strewn around as something to grab in a minigame, or something you could spend the myriad of coins you'd get on. Not only did these provide you with these impressive 3D models of different characters and items from the game, but they also served as a treasure trove of classic Nintendo history, covering games both old and new, relevant and irrelevant. Each trophy could not only be viewed and enjoyed in their full glory, but also each came with a cute little description that told you a little bit about the character or the game they were from. And honestly, I was straight up addicted to collecting these things as a kid, and it's hard not to see why. Not only was watching the collection slowly grow from a tiny bunch of nonsense to a whole treasure trove incredibly satisfying, but
Best
getting
trophy.
to read the story behind all these things I'd never seen before was just so fascinating to me. And these are just another thing that makes Melee so fondly remembered to this day. And considering how much they add to the feeling of this being a crossover celebrating all of Nintendo history, and how inherently exciting they are to collect, you'd have to be pretty stupid to get rid of these and not provide a decent replacement.
I mean, it was fun to collect them.
Though, speaking of that crossover element,
I agree.
that kind of begs an interesting question. What if the crossover extended to more than just characters or trophies? What if you went a little further and built a mode around the entire idea of combining these universes together? While Smash was always billed as a crossover between Nintendo's biggest franchises, it felt like it never really reached as far as it could in 64, as the crossover really only extended to characters and stages. But with Melee's adventure mode, that all changed. Suddenly, franchises were given way more fan service than ever before. This mode allowed players to run through a veritable sample platter of different Nintendo franchises in incredibly novel ways. Run through an entire Mario level, fit with Goombas to stomp and shells to throw. Explore a miniature Zelda dungeon. Battle Samus to the death before needing to go through a classic Metroid escape sequence, fit with an entire planet exploding, only to travel to Popstar and do battle with Kirby. Participate in a Pokemon battle. Meet up with Ness at Onett. Run through a whole F-Zero track. Adventure mode was just chock full of reference after reference, and in far more interesting ways than regular old Smash fights. It feels like a genuine love letter to the franchises represented, and even if a couple of parts boil down to fight little DK and then fight big DK because this really good fan service, the mode as a whole is just such a novel concept. Like Smash was always a platform fighter, but it's cool to see actual platforming put to use in a way that was incredibly novel for the time. And considering the layout of the mode itself and the actual focus on making levels for the player to run through, you gotta wonder, how cool would an actual mode structured like this be? One with the full story and everything. Also, while Master Hand and Crazy Hand were cool and all, nothing they could do could quite match what would happen if you were lucky, or should I say unlucky enough, to make it to the end of this mode on the higher difficulties. So picture this. It's a late summer night, the sounds of the world only slightly blanketed by the sounds of Melee's battles, the volume lowered just enough to make sure no one was aware that you were still awake. And as you make yet another run through one of your favorite modes in one of your favorite GameCube games, you decide that you had enough of the lower difficulties and that they were too easy for you. So you raised that difficulty up, and though it proved a little tougher than you expected, you made it to the final fight. Battered and bruised, you give it your all, and the victory comes fairly easily, actually. And as you set the controller aside, ready to watch the same wrap-up cutscene and credit sequence like you've always watched before, a new cutscene starts. One you've never seen before. So, no joke, this actually scared me the first time I saw it. I had run through this mode so many times that it had become borderline routine, so to suddenly see something like this, at night no less, yeah, needless to say, it caught me a little off guard. And yet something about it fascinated me. Giga Bowser's design was just so raw and crazy in a way Bowser is almost never presented, and from then on I was obsessed with this character.
I wonder how common knowledge it is that you actually can play as Giga Bowser.
Device that let you do some pretty wacky stuff to try and play as him, and I bought the wrong one. Great. But that's the thing. There was just something that captivated me about Melee in a way that almost no multiplayer games could ever muster. I was so desperate to see everything the game had to offer, exploring every inch of it that I could access. And this led me to some interesting places. I remember there was this door in the temple stage, and I was so determined to get it open because I was sure that there was a way to, and that if I did, there'd be something magical just beyond its iron bars. And speaking of temple, I'd come across this strange black hole glitch you could do there, and I was so desperate to try it out. Although my friends and I were never coordinated enough to actually do it, so that kind of sucked. I also remember seeing this description for Goldine in the trophies section implying that she was good in water, and that their horn drill attack was so strong it could KO people in one hit. And so I spent an absurd amount of time trying to get one to fall into the water, and it didn't do anything. Time well spent, clearly. The game just gave me so many of those weird formative memories, though, you know what I'm saying? And regardless of the strangeness of that story, or any of the others I have regarding Melee, whether it be my surefire determination to get behind a purely decorative set of iron bars, or spending hours playing cruel Melee to try and unlock Sonic the Hedgehog, only to later discover that
get
it
some
was
love.
nothing but a fake rumor.
Love to see it.
The legions and legions of memories I had formed playing Melee with my friends over the years, Melee proved time and time again to be a game that I couldn't get enough of. I spend more time with Melee than any other Smash game, and still to this day I have a profound amount of love and respect for the game. And while those memories would have always kept it important to me from a nostalgia perspective, I'm glad that unlike something like 64, where the game has limited appeal nowadays outside of revisiting it for novelty or nostalgia or its very small competitive community, Melee was also able to stand the test of time not just through its multiplayer, but through its single player content as well. It was just such a massive all-reaching package that provides entertainment still to this day, whether you're getting lost in its multiplayer battles or partaking in the shocking amount of single-player content the game has under its belt. But while that would have always kept Melee relevant as time went on in a way multiplayer games often don't see, it would turn out that Melee wouldn't even need it. Because just when the competitive community should have moved on from it, leaving it behind for the next game in the series, the game would suddenly become more alive than it ever was before. And all because of the very same nightmarish development cycle that spawned it to begin with.
Continue.
It's fitting to have the Fox there as well.
One of the consequences of Melee's strained development cycle was that the team didn't really have time for bug testing or extra polish, leaving several fairly odd bugs and glitches in the base game. And while most of these are just strange novelties, the people who took Smash more seriously began to notice that certain glitches had a lot of potential. Of these were wave dashing, a technique whereby a player can perform an air dodge towards the ground the moment they enter the air, allowing the player to retain the momentum of said air dodge while shifting across the ground, also keeping the player focused forward. There was also L canceling, which allowed the player to reduce landing lag after an aerial attack after pressing...
I mean, I understand this video is much more like, you know, like explaining and showing things for like a more casual audience, but like, yeah, I would say it's kind of unfair to call it a glitch, but yeah, more tech skill. L cancel or like Z canceling, I guess, in Smash 64 is it's actually like, I think it's like twice as good in Smash 64 since it reduces like all the landing lag. So it's like twice as good, or essentially twice as good. So that already existed, the same concept. They just made it less strong in this game. Yeah, you could say L cancel actually got balanced from 64 to Melee. It would be way too much to keep it that same way as it was in 64 to Melee. So that was a good balance, you know, not a patch, but like nerfing the tech. And then wave dash, I mean, if you just think about it, like it makes sense. Like if you're doing an air dodge, you know, diagonal to the ground, it's like, what is going to happen otherwise, right? And even though that wasn't like intended, they did know about it. But I guess they just thought that, you know, it doesn't really matter, you know. You can do it, and it's just like a fun little party trick, I guess. Yeah, I've heard that as well, that C cancel was more meant to be like allowing to shield after an aerial. I feel like I've heard that. How true that is, don't quote me on that, but I've heard that same reasoning. But But yeah, even so, L canceling was still like, nerfed, if you want to put it that way. But yeah, I'm not gonna go on too much. As I said, this video is more for like a casual audience.
One of the shoulder buttons, or Z, right as they're hitting the ground. These, alongside several techniques like short hops, DIing, and dash dancing, allowed players who really knew Melee's mechanics at a deeper level to pull off some incredibly impressive stuff. And while Sakurai and Nintendo largely saw Melee as more of a fun party game, the community around it felt differently, and thus an early enthusiastic tournament scene started. Tournaments, small and large alike, would spring up, with several players pushing the game's mechanics further and further. While some other fighting game communities like to insult or demean the Smash scene because it's not a real fighting game, the people who were enthusiastic about Melee were really enthusiastic about Melee. And boy, they had to be, because soon that community would face more strife than they ever imagined.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also say, like, for me, I think, like, a great game can often be played in many different ways, right? It doesn't have to be, like, played one way. And I mean, I know we've talked about this in the past, but, like, that's something I will never understand with Nintendo as a company, where it's like, play this way or don't play at all. That type of mentality. I know it's not everyone at Nintendo, and not even everyone that worked with Melee or at Melee or any other game. I don't think that, everyone working in the game shared the exact same vision, but Nintendo as a company, they're very like, do it exactly the way I want to, or don't do it at all. And I think that's a shame. It's more like, if you have a game and people can love it in like 10, 20, 100 different ways, I mean, I think that's amazing. Like, of course, most people that have played Melee at some point played it casually, right? And you could enjoy it casually. It was a fantastic game casually. And a lot of people loved it casually. But why is it wrong to like play it serious as well, right? I think that's always like one of the weird things with Nintendo. It's like, they should appreciate the fact that people can love a lot of games, or at least some games, in infinite amount of ways. That to me is like a true like great grade for a game. Like SM64, like obviously, fantastic revolutionary casual game, but it's also like an insanely good speedrun game. So it's like you can love it in different ways, and that is to me what makes a lot of iconic games, that they can be strong in numerous fields.
With Super Smash Bros. Brawl releasing in 2008, the general expectation was that everyone would leave Melee behind and move on to it instead. However, Brawl proved to be a little divisive among Melee fans, as the mechanics proved floatier and less crunchy than its predecessor. The discourse surrounding this got incredibly toxic incredibly quickly, with Melee fans and Brawl fans arguing back and forth for years. A discourse that would unfortunately affect the next game's reputation in a way that is quite unfortunate. Still, the situation wasn't ideal for anyone. This left Melee fans between a rock and a hard place, as they'd either have to stick with a game that they felt was inferior, or head back to a game that seemed for all the world a fading legend. And despite the odds being against it, the community would stand with the game they liked better, trying their best to keep the game relevant. And early on, things were tough, with the community barely able to stay afloat during the rise of Brawl. The tournament scene was incredibly small, most of it solely carried by the love of the game. And despite all of their efforts, for a while it seemed like it'd all be for naught, as it was entirely possible that the game would just fade into irrelevance, just like everyone expected it to. However, that wouldn't be the end of the story. Momentum would slowly build and build. New, flashy competitors would rise to prominence, pushing the limits of what the game had to offer.
Never thought I would see hacks with the Falcon one again.
Many began to notice just how cool Melee could be, and all of this newfound energy brought more and more eyes to the game. And it wasn't long before it had a massive, passionate community behind it. The game was even able to get into EVO 2013 through community efforts, which cemented the game as a juggernaut and a spectacle to be paid attention to. However, with so many eyes in the game, it's only natural that some of them weren't going to be friendly. Because in the background, an entity loomed, one that seemed incredibly bitter about Melee's newfound popularity. And while EVO 2013 was a huge event for getting Melee on many's radar, it almost didn't happen, because said entity did everything in their power to get the event shut down, only reversing its decision after an intense wave of backlash. And this entity was the very company that created Melee to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about this a lot over the years, but like that story will never stop being crazy to me. Like you have a gaming community raising like almost $100,000. I think it was like 94,000 something, 95,000 something for breast cancer research. And it's like most companies would be like, they probably would be like, partially that, they love our game, that's amazing, but also probably like, raising so much money for a good cause, that's amazing, right? But Nintendo more like, breast cancer research, I guess fuck that, let's try to shut down the tournament. I will never ever understand that. And whoever was like the main person in charge of that decision, I would love to hear their reasoning, trying to explain why this was a good idea. And most companies would probably match it. There probably would be some companies that would try to match it, as a publicity thing. But like for Nintendo, it was like, yes, let's shut it down. I remember I was actually in the UK with Android. We had like a 20-hour layover flight. So we were playing like some Smash with Prof and some other people before heading back to the airport. And that's when like this decision about Melee not happening at EVO any longer was like announced. So when we went on the flight, we had no idea, what happened. So when we arrived and people picked us up at the airport, we had to like ask like what happened, And luckily, of course, the tournament did happen.
Nintendo has always seemed to have this bizarre, bitter contempt for the competitive scene, a contempt that is entirely unwarranted. Nintendo historically had problems with people playing their game for an audience of any kind, like they were allergic to any kind of, free promotion, but their relationship with Melee has always been far more toxic, trying to get tournaments removed, backing down, acting like they care the next year, and then proving they don't just a little further down the line. Really, the biggest block in the way of Melee's success always seems to be Nintendo. And here's the thing,
it's so sad.
Would kill to have a game with this much passionate support. And yet Nintendo isn't just indifferent to its success, they actively seem to get in the way of Melee as a whole. And even more unfortunate is that the Nintendo community as a whole tends to side with Nintendo, as the sting of some of the more toxic and bitter arguments of the Brawl Age seem to stick to the perception of Melee and its community as a whole. And yet the Melee community keeps fighting on, pushing their game further and further, fighting a never-ending battle against not just the Smash community at large,
the worst air dodge ever,
itself. A story that turns and turns and turns ad infinitum. Though all of this being said, Melee really is a special once-in-a-lifetime game. The reality is, no matter if you play it competitively or not, whether you can wave dash with your eyes closed or you can barely button mash, the one thing that remains true is that Super Smash Bros. Melee has connected with people all across the world. It's a game that has a resonance that goes beyond time, keeping people enraptured and infatuated with it all of these years later. For me, it was an experience that made mountains of memories, a game I excitedly played into the late hours of the night, goofing around with friends, playing matches with absolutely stupid combinations of items, getting absolutely flabbergasted by the hilarity of some of the weird-ass modes the game had. It's something I still adore to this day, and a game I frequently think back on with such an incredible amount of nostalgia. And there are others, likely millions all across the world, that have been touched by Melee as well. And while the story behind the game may be utterly bizarre, filled with turmoil for both its developers and players alike, one thing that can't be denied is that Melee changed lives, and is one of the most bizarre, enthralling, utterly insane games I've ever seen, and a game that deserves to be called a masterpiece.
True. Deserves to be called a masterpiece. And I think it was a solid video. Of course, like the more casual appeal to it overall, but still like the video. And I think it overall also gave a good idea to the message that you can play the game in many different ways and still enjoy it. Most of us know that hopefully one day Nintendo can learn that lesson as well. So yeah, that's gonna be my final words on it.